The Germans came here with all sorts of skill in beer making, piano making, machinery kinds of things. Blacks, of course, emerging from slavery had enormous disadvantages, even as compared to people emerging from slavery in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because for one thing, in the United States, blacks were not allowed to have any responsibility under slavery. That one of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Now, people tried to do that in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't as possible, say, in the West Indies, because there weren't enough whites, for example, in the West Indies to matter. So if blacks were going to be fed in the West Indies, they had to be fed by growing their own food.
Like Angola and like the Portuguese colonies compared to, say, South Africa.
Yes. And so therefore the blacks, say, in the West Indies had all sorts of experience growing their own food, selling the surplus in the market, and in fact being responsible for budgeting what they had. Blacks in the United States were deliberately kept from having that. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
Well, I was going to ask you that. You've anticipated me. To what extent do you find that then that the welfare state is trying to preserve an ethos which precisely, I understand you to say, we need to liberate ourselves from?
Yes, that politics really involves getting people to vote for you, and people vote for you when they think that they can depend on you, when they are dependent on you. To the extent that people become self-reliant and can feel they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, to that extent do you lose your hold on their votes. Much or represented in various occupations. You're not going to be an engineer unless you've got an engineering degree. And if blacks' degrees are in education, then we don't expect to find blacks represented in engineering in proportion to blacks in the society.
So that's an example in which our cultural choice determines our income, and our income is partly due to the income gap between blacks and whites. Is that part of it?
Yes, yes. But that's true not only with blacks and whites, it's true right across the board. The difference between Asians and Hispanics, for example, at the PhD level and earlier, is slightly greater than that between blacks and Asians, or certainly greater than that between blacks and whites. So the black-white difference that we're always comparing is not at all unique. The income difference between Japanese Americans and Puerto Ricans is higher than that between blacks and whites. And yet if you explain the black-white difference in terms of the unique history of blacks, you are left out on a limb wondering, well, then why then do the Japanese exceed the Puerto Ricans by so much when their history is absolutely different from either of those two groups?
What about the role of politics in the economic future of blacks in this country?
Again, I would draw upon the experience of other countries and other groups. I can't think of a single group anywhere in the world that has risen from poverty to affluence through politics. There are any number of groups that have risen from poverty to affluence through almost every other conceivable means. When I look at the groups that have had spectacular rises like people are saying, poor people can't rise in America anymore. And the data that they use leave out immigrants. Immigrants come here with little more than the clothes on their back. Go in here and by the next generation, their kids are excelling in school, going off to leading colleges and into professions.